Hi there, welcome and thank you for joining me today for this podcast on directive, non-directive and clean coaching. My name is Angela Dunbar and this podcast is the first in a series of three based on a recent presentation I gave at the Coaching at Work yearly conference which took place in London on the 1st of July 2015. Okay, I'll start by explaining to you that the title the title of this podcast was originally going to be Directive versus Non-Directive Coaching, really to kind of reflect the choice or even dilemma that coaches seem to face today around these two different styles of coaching. In the end, I added in clean coaching as this was very much the lens through which we'll be exploring this topic, and also the lens through which I began exploring in order to put this podcast together. If you've not heard of clean coaching, it's certainly my passion. It's what I use as my predominant method as a coach. I also train other coaches in this approach as well as supervise coaches using clean methods. We won't really be directly talking about clean coaching in any of these podcasts, although I allude to it every now and again. So if it piques your interest in clean coaching as an approach, then by all means, please get in touch. Have a look at our website, www.cleancoaching.com, if you want to find out more. I'll just explain for now, in a nutshell, that clean coaching is really a way of working with people that gets beyond the abstract generalisms that people use in conversation and really closer to the personal meaning that those generalisms have for them. And we do that through, one way we do that is through exploring the metaphors that people use in their conversation inadvertently and unintentionally. But those metaphors reveal something about how they're thinking. So for instance, it was a good place for me to start in that when I thought about directive and non-directive coaching, I asked myself the question, when I'm being directive, for me, that's like what? And the metaphor that came up for me, loud and clear really, was when I'm being directive, it's like I'm an archer shooting an arrow. I have to see a target. I have to know the bullseye that I'm aiming for. And I need to take a really good aim. And if I do that and I fire an accurate shot, I can get somewhere very quickly. My arrow fires straight and fast. I can help my coachee reach an outcome very quickly. So that told me something about what directive coaching, if you like, feels like. It's something about that taking aim and firing. And then when I thought about non-directive in the same way, I had a very different kind of sense and a very different metaphor came up for me. And that was that non-directive coaching for me is more like a compass. So it's not so much about getting anywhere. It's more about providing a tool of navigation and recognizing that it's about helping the coachee decide where they need to go next based on where they are now. And the compass is going to change direction, if you like, change where it points with each step of the way, because as the coachee moves into a different position, where they need to, the direction they need to aim for is possibly going to change too. And there was also something in that for me about destinations can change too. Where we might want to get to at the beginning of a journey may well change along the way. So the compass isn't necessarily saying in which direction is the right direction. It's just providing more clues as to where you're going to get to if you go into different directions. So that told me something about what non-directive coaching felt like to me, the compass as opposed to the directive arrow. And for those of you listening in, you might be thinking, well, it doesn't make any sense to you at all. And there are very different metaphors and meanings that these two words have for you. And, that's absolutely fine. And as we go through this podcast, I do ask you to kind of consider what directive and non-directive coaching is like for you. Everyone's going to have a different answer to that. But one thing that seems common to all is how often metaphors around space and direction creep in to coaching conversations. And I guess that's what led to the subtitle of the podcast, which is, whose direction is it anyway? Now, I put together a few key aims for this presentation, and I'm kind of building on from what I've just said. I think one of my key aims is to show you how directions, metaphors about directions, come up all the time in coaching conversations and how they really can make the difference. One of the inspirations for this topic, if you like, in this podcast was the title of the Coaching at Work conference this year was Onwards and Upwards. And they are certainly two very noble directions to head in. But again, it just reminded me of how often coaches will assume perhaps a certain direction is going to be right for their coachee based on perhaps what the coachee has already told them. Secondly, I want to help widen your perspective around this directive versus non-directive dilemma that seems to face coaches. There's more to it than just a simple either or choice. And we'll be taking the extreme positions and challenging some of the taken for granted views as to what it means to be a directive coach or a non-directive coach, and help you see things perhaps in a very different way. I'm also going to draw your attention to the kind of shady area in the middle, if you like, when a coach feels they're treading the middle ground and they're not being extremely directive, nor are they being completely non-directive. And I'm going to suggest that that kind of in-between place is actually the dangerous place to be, and how we can inadvertently influence coaches when we don't intend to. And in doing so, our coachee misses the opportunity to think for themselves in fresh and different ways. And finally, we're going to learn some ways to limit directiveness, especially unconscious directiveness, without ending up feeling as though we've got nowhere to aim for, so without ending up aimless. And, I guess the core about this is that being non-directive doesn't have to mean that sessions become pointless. We're going to cover a discipline, if you like, for our coaching that gives you a way of working that helps you to allow your coachee to find their own direction. I'm not going to give you all the answers in this first podcast, or even if you listen to all 3 podcasts. It's aiming to be thought-provoking rather than giving the answers, although towards the end you will get something more tangible to take away and put into practice based on the clean coaching approach. Okay, so I want to start today by exploring another kind of quandary that seems to exist within the coaching profession today. Generally, it seems there's a big difference between what coaches consider to be best practice compared to what clients expect from us. And I was asking myself, why is that? Why is there such a big difference, or appears to be such a big difference? And I think one thing is certain, and that's coaching has not been around for that long. It's a relatively new profession. And the roots of coaching come from a more traditional instructive background. Even as late as the late 80s, early 90s, when I went on my first coaching training course as a manager, I was taught something which was far more like telling than coaching is that we know today. So, what we consider as coaching has changed quite dramatically in a short space of time. The modern meaning is certainly about asking somebody to find their own answers rather than tell them what we think. And the premise behind that, most coaches will agree that it's pretty effective to facilitate a person to find their own solutions. And that is, for many of us, the core value of coaching. That's what makes it distinctive from other learning methods. However, you'll find many coachees expect to be guided. They expect to be told. And when a coachee is asking you questions about what you think and asking you to give them the answers, it can be very hard to resist. Not least because we slip into conversational habits. As one person is asking questions of us, we fall into those norms of behaviours, and it seems, appropriate from a social perspective to provide the answers that another is asking from us. We get drawn into conversational habits, and it's very difficult to get out of. Normal roles and behaviours, again, that your coachee is likely to expect, the expert versus the novice, the teacher versus the pupil. And as I say, once we fall into one of those patterns of conversations, it's really difficult to get back out. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying through any of this that I actually consider that training and mentoring is ineffective, or that directiveness is somehow unhelpful or not good. What I am saying is that training and mentoring fundamentally satisfy a different need. When you're training somebody, you're providing them with the answers, you're educating them and teaching them the skills in a hands-on way, if you like. You're telling them the answers. In the appropriate context, in a contracted for relationship, it may be perfectly acceptable. Coaching, however, is something very different. And I think there's a clue in the words that we use to describe these terms. And again, I'm going to draw your attention to metaphors, because of course there are metaphors inherent in these words. What is a coach? What is a train? Well, when I think of a train, I think about a vehicle that runs along a track. It can only run along that track. It is supposed to run along that track. It has predestined stops along the way. It has predictable outcomes. The ultimate destination is decided before you get on that train. You know where you're going when you get on a train. As opposed to a coach, and maybe give me just a little bit of poetic license here and think of the olden days stagecoach, perhaps a slightly smaller vehicle than the huge things that run along the motorways today. But even so, I think even that would make my point, in that coaches are a little bit more flexible. They don't have to run along the same route. They can take a different path or a different road. And certainly if they come across any kind of roadblock or traffic, they can change their route accordingly. The other thing is, in theory, a coach could decide to go to an entirely different destination. It isn't predetermined, although I know these days with coach routes it may appear that way. In theory, as a vehicle, the coach can go down any path and take you to any destination. And most importantly, that destination could be decided along the way. So I hope this is just helping you to think about, why coaches might slip into training mode. Not least because it's what the coachee expects, but also because that's what coaching used to be all about. So even though nowadays we think of it as best practice to be non-directive, there's quite a lot of energy running in an entirely different direction. Another way of looking at this dichotomy between directive and non-directive is to, instead of consider it an either-or choice, to think of it as a range. And many coaching experts define this as a spectrum, if you like. There are a range of different approaches. Some will be more directive and some will be more non-directive. There's many different models, many different coaching authors and experts refer to this kind of range in different ways. And the one that I'm referring to today is one by Peter Hill from his book Concepts of Coaching. And as with many people that look at this model, he kind of highlights different kinds of behaviours that would give you a clue as to whereabouts you might be on this spectrum, moment by moment, if you like. So at one extreme end, at the extreme directive end, we have behaviours that are all about pushing your solution, pushing your answer onto the other person. Whereas at the non-directive end, it's all about pulling the answers out from your coachee. And then in the middle, you'll see all along here are the different behaviours that Peter Hill suggests kind of fits somewhere along this spectrum. So, over at the non-directive pull end, we've got things like listening, reflecting back the other person's words, and then over at the other extremes, instructing them, giving them advice. And then we've got some things in the middle here. Questions, asking questions and making suggestions are considered to be somewhere in the middle. This is quite a useful model because it indicates that we don't have to choose ultimately whether or not we're going to be directive or non-directive, because we can change our approach moment by moment. We can be flexible. And most coaches go along with that. And most coach experts suggest that we can vary our approach. And as long as we're being non-directive most of the time, then that's probably going to serve our coachee pretty well. And as you're thinking about this yourself, you'll probably recognise, as well as the particular behaviours that you might display moment by moment, there's also something about your overall style as well that seems to cut across this. So you'll have a natural preference, I guess, for a set of behaviours somewhere along this spectrum. So there is a message here that being mostly non-directive is good enough. And I guess I'm going to challenge that slightly with some further information for you to think about. One thing is really to get beneath this model, and all these kinds of models, the original version, as best I can identify, came from the mid-70s by John Herron, and it was called the 6 Categories of Intervention. And he developed this similar kind of spectrum idea, but it wasn't just for coaching, it was for all kinds of people helping. It was from his book in the 70s called Helping the Client. So it was for counsellors, therapists, trainers, anyone, doctors, lawyers, and the idea was that depending on your role, you would fall into a different position. In later editions of his book, once coaching had become popular, he took an opinion that was something that had a rightful place, certainly far more on the facilitative rather than the authoritative end of the spectrum, which were the two terms he used. Looking at this through Herrons' model, it gives us a couple of other dimensions really to think about. And one was the importance, although he does list behaviours, and I'll go through some of those behaviours with you in just a moment, he felt that underlying any behaviour, and perhaps more important than the behaviour, was the intention of the facilitator. What did they expect would happen as a result of their question? And that's where the terms facilitative and authoritative came from. Who do you expect holds the answers? So the facilitative coach or person helper, if you like, is genuinely looking for answers to come from the other person. The more authoritative coach may well be asking questions and listening and reflecting back. But deep inside, their intention is to lead the coachee towards what they believe is best for the coachee. Now, the interesting thing about intention, of course, is that some of your intention is not necessarily conscious. This is going on without you necessarily being aware of it. So intention can be unconscious as well as conscious. Another aspect, as well as the intention, unconscious or conscious, is represented by this blue triangle at the bottom here. And this is all about how much responsibility you and your coachee take in the coaching session. And that, I think, is a really interesting thing for coaches to think about. The more responsibility you take as the coach, the less the coachee is able to take. So down here, closer to the non-directive, you have very little responsibility, but the further along that path you go towards the authoritative directive approach, the greater and greater responsibility you are naturally, automatically taking on. And there is only so much responsibility to go around. So the more responsibility you take as a coach, the less there is for the coachee to take for themselves. So in many ways, when you are directive with your coachee, you are depriving them of the opportunity to take responsibility for themselves. Whereas when you're more non-directive, it's one way of empowering a person. Because if the answers aren't coming from someone else, they are more likely to start looking for them inside themselves. And this all might sound very obvious, but again, remember, conversational habits mean that we're all like it. We're all at it. In conversations, the natural path, the natural way that conversations go is we give each other advice. We tell each other what to do. And that's where I feel the true power of coaching comes from, is to resist that and give your coachee the time and the space to come up with their own answers. Okay, and we're looking at very different ways of thinking about directive and non-directive. Rather than just an either-or choice, we're thinking about it as a range of flexible behaviours. And we can get beneath John Herrons' model and have a look at some of those behaviours in a bit more detail. So on the authoritative style, He came up with, this is quite different from the Peter Hill model we just looked at. He came up with 3 core authoritative approaches, if you like. Prescriptive, which is a little bit like your doctor, expert, who's writing out a prescription and very clearly telling the other person what to do, telling them how they should do it, and giving them very clearly owned advice and guidance. One step down from that is the informative response, where you're giving your views or experience, perhaps you're explaining background and principles, helping the other person get a better understanding. It strikes me that all coaches will be informative right at the beginning of a coaching relationship when they're going through their contracting. Aspects of your contract you need to inform your coachee very clearly about. So there certainly is a time and a place for informative. The third level down in the authoritative is confronting. And I know many coaches fully support that confronting, challenging is so important in a coaching assignment, to challenge the other person's views. John Herron described it here as part of an authoritative approach. I believe you can challenge without being directive, but I'll come back to that later on in the podcast series. So those are our 3 authoritative styles. We also have 3 facilitative styles. At the top here is cathartic. This would be where you are allowing the other person to truly express their feelings, say what's really going on for them, encourage them to let it all out, if you like. And in doing so, it kind of becomes a bit of a release. Catalytic is questions that are not to look for the right answer or for you to learn information. The questions are for a specific purpose, and that is to encourage the other person to think differently, encourage them to find new options and solutions, as well as listening, deep listening at an active level, if you like. Not surprisingly, John Herron identified catalytic as the core place that coaches probably ought to spend most of their time. And then the most facilitative, the last one down, is the completely supportive position where you're basically praising the other person, telling them how much you value them, building them up, if you like, encouraging and supporting them in that way. So we've looked at 2 slightly different models that list out behaviours, but underlying the behaviours were other important points around your overall style, what you feel most natural and comfortable with, what your intention is, bearing in mind that can be unconscious as well as conscious, and also your sense of responsibility for what happens in the coaching session. And now I'd like you really to think about all of these subjects, reflect back on that coaching spectrum, the line between push and pull, and consider what kind of coach are you? And what's your default position? Are you at the directive or the non-directive end, or somewhere in the middle? Is there any particular behaviour or style that you're currently avoiding? And as we come to the end of this first podcast, I'd just like to pose a question for you. Whereabouts are you on that push versus pull spectrum? Now, when I delivered this as a presentation in London just a couple of weeks ago, it was to a room full of people, and I actually suggested that we created a mental line, if you like, in the space around us, going from one end of the room to the other. So we actually all jumped up and walked to a spot in the room that represented where we were on that spectrum. And I had about 50, 60 people in the room, and there was a lot kind of congregating, I guess, around the middle. And there was, certainly some negotiation of spaces as people kind of looked around and saw where other people were standing. And it's difficult for me to recreate that for you now, other than to suggest you could do the same kind of thing and just imagine there is a line going from one corner of your room to the other corner. And if that were a line representing extreme directive versus extreme non-directive, where would you stand along that line? We haven't time to cover it in any depth, but many people believe that actually getting a person to stand up and move to a space and stand in that space can somehow subtly help open up different paths of thinking. So just bear that in mind, and if you want to try that out as an experiment for yourself, it would be very interesting to hear back from you and how it works. Let's suppose that you have put yourself in a space, mentally or physically, and can see yourself somewhere along that line. And my next question to you is really, how do you know that's where you are? What is it that's informing you of your degree of directive versus non-directive? So ponder on that. How do you know that's where you are? And I'd really like you to just jot down a few thoughts before you rejoin me for the second part of this podcast, which should be available to you in a very short space of time. Okay, thank you very much, and I look forward to connecting with you again very soon.